Professor Zammani, thank you very much. Parlo in italiano per questa splendida presentazione. La mia questione tratta del problema della disuguaglianza. Io sono completamente convinto, lei ha nominato i lavori rilevanti, che al di là di un certo livello la ineguaglianza è persino un impedimento alla crescita. Credo che però che nella discussione su un capitalismo morale rimanga importante distinguere tra povertà assoluta e povertà relativa. La povertà relativa viene definita in vari termini, certe volte quelli che hanno meno di 50, certe volte quelli che hanno meno di 60% del reddito mediano, ma il punto essenziale è che noi possiamo facilmente immaginarci una situazione nella quale la povertà assoluta viene superata e allo stesso tempo la povertà relativa aumenta. Se quelli che producono di più, se il loro capitale non viene distribuito in maniera uguale. E io credo che non sia sbagliato dire che il primo punto per un economista è il desiderio di superare la povertà assoluta, anche se naturalmente non è facile dire che cos'è esattamente la povertà assoluta, ma è stata usata prima la bella definizione, una povertà che uccide. E accettare per una fase di transizione anche un aumento di ineguaglianza, se ciò aiuta a superare la povertà assoluta, secondo me può essere moralmente lecito e mi interesserebbe sapere la sua posizione riguardo a questa domanda.
Yes, it is true. Globalization has reduced in the last 25-30 years absolute poverty. The recent estimates, they talk about 900 million people. But at the same time, relative poverty, which means inequality, has increased. And the point is that as Branko Milanovic, head economist of the World Bank, a few years ago, has demonstrated, there are two different notions of inequalities, what he called global inequality and international inequality. Now, international inequalities has decreased, but global inequality has increased. The point is that sometimes the media they keep on making a lot of confusion between absolute and relative poverty and between global and international. For instance, the case of China and India. In the international inequality, you compare the average income of different countries. So that is why international inequality has decreased, because the so-called developing countries have made major effort. But if you consider the global inequality, in other words, taking into consideration the inequality inside as well as international, it has increased. And that is what, for instance, the Pope in Gaudium, Evangelii Gaudium, and also in the last encyclical, perhaps with a different language, draws our attention. In other words, if we are interested in human beings, it is obvious that we have to look at the global inequality, not international inequality. In general, politicians are more interested in international inequality, because if my country reduces its inequality in comparison to other countries, I can get it. But to conclude, it is obvious that inequality is always against economic rationality. Always, always, always. Absolute poverty, no, could be tolerated. But a market economy couldn't work properly when inequality is above a certain threshold. Only those people who do not know enough economic theory can think differently. But all the great economists of the past, starting from Adam Smith onwards, made the point very clear.
I had a question for each, for Stefano and Jeffrey, if they might. There's a risk of being overwhelmed by the scale of the problems we face. And I wonder if each of you might identify a single policy that you think is politically feasible that would make a significant difference in this realm. And perhaps there may be a distinction between the global north and the global south. But I think it would be helpful if you might identify something that we might actually work for, that we have some real political hope of achieving.
Sure, that's easy. No. Okay. And anything that resists power is hard. There is no, therefore, easy answer from a political point of view. But from a substantive point of view, it's not a hard question in the following sense. We know, for example, why the Scandinavian income distribution is 0.28 on that Gini coefficient, and in the United States is 0.47. It's actually not because of the marketplace, which is quite unequal in both economies. It's because of what government does in Scandinavia. The government taxes heavily and then uses the revenues to provide universal health care, universal education, free tuition, child support, family support, child care, and many, many other universal benefits. The United States cuts taxes, especially for the rich, and then has almost no social programs other than the partial coverage in the health sector and Social Security. There's almost no family support. Young people have $1 trillion of debt on their school fees because the tuitions are not covered by the state. There is no maternity leave. There is no government-supported child care. So the two societies have taken a very different approach. One ends up with equality and high faith in government. The other ends up with mass inequality and no faith in government. And this, I think, is quite straightforward, but politically not so easy to achieve. I have my senator who was my classmate from Harvard, is a Democratic Party senator of the state of New York. He's called a left of center in the US, but no, because in the US he campaigns for the tax cuts for the hedge funds as his main mission because they fund his campaigns. So this is how it works. So we end up without the government revenues and without the policies. On the international side, it's even easier because even 1% of the income of the rich world would end the extreme poverty in the poor world. And 5 countries give what they promise: Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg, and now the UK, interestingly, because of a mass civil society movement. Netherlands close, but the United States spends less than 0.2% of our national income on help for the poor and spends 30 times more on the military than it does on the help for the poor. So with a decent budget of financial assistance, one could end the 6 million children dying before the age of 5 because their deaths are caused by known, easily preventable, easily treated conditions if there's a rudimentary health intervention present. I was advisor to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon for the last 15 years. We were able to succeed in getting a new fund started to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. There was huge resistance among the elites. It's even a small amount of money. Interestingly, President George Bush was the supporter of it in the end. With that funding, malaria deaths are down by 70%. When I went back to try to get the funding to finish this job, I was told, no, there's no more funding. It's not a matter of evidence, decency, science. It's just that because the taxes are low on the hedge fund managers, there's no money to control malaria. So fundamentally, these are moral issues. They're not even economic issues. My only job is to translate disease into the money required. It's a few $1 billion. Every day the Pentagon spends $2 billion. So I keep telling the Pentagon, take a vacation. Take July off. That by itself would be $60 billion. And if we could do that, we would solve so many problems. But there's also an ideology of confusion that I have to emphasize, because one of the defenses of the elites is to say, that won't work, Professor Sachs. So 15 years ago, I proposed giving antiretroviral medicines to infected individuals who were dying of AIDS. Even the head of the US agency said, no, Africans don't know how to tell time, they won't be able to take the medicine. He kept his job, actually. Now there are 15 million people on treatment, and they take their medicine on time and they stay alive. 15 years ago, I said, give the bed nets away for free. Oh, everybody, all my economist colleagues said, no, you must not do that. People don't value things if they get it for free. Only rich people do. Poor people don't. So there was a big fight. It took 7 years. Finally, 1 billion bed nets were distributed because Secretary General Ban Ki-moon insisted. He insisted. And he told us, that's the UN policy now. Malaria down by 70%. So all I can tell you is these are solvable problems. The biggest barrier is ideological and power, not the technical solutions, not even the amounts of money involved. These are not technical problems, they're not economic problems, they are moral problems. And if we cared just a little bit more in the power structures, we would solve these problems.
There are more questions? Please.
Thank you. As a politician, I must confess that I feel that a part of your arguments sounds rather abstract. Let us take the problem of the Scandinavian states. What is the reason why they can do that? The reason is that they have a society that is largely based upon a very highly developed economy of knowledge. And they have patents, and they have companies that must stay there because they have the knowledge that is needed in order to let them run. Imagine that you try to make that policy. Let us tax more the rich in order to support better the poor in a country that has no such knowledge economy. What will happen? Oh, I tell you, in a globalized economy, you know much better than me, the rich people will take their money out of the country, and millions of jobs will fly out of this country to other countries that offer them better conditions, where better conditions may mean lower wages and less protection for workers' rights. So if we want really to make it possible for poor countries to tax the rich, and very often poor countries have rather important numbers of rich people, then the first thing is we need a general agreement on wages and labor. We had several years ago, in 1994, in Marrakech, the general agreement on tariffs and trade. We need a general agreement on wages and labor. If we do not have a general agreement on wages and labor, it will be very difficult for poor countries to adopt the recipe that you suggest. And by the way, perhaps we need also a fiscal agreement against tax elusion. That is, the fact that people go to pay taxes in other countries. Something is being done now on this point. In Europe, we are doing something. Perhaps not enough, but it is a fresh start and a good beginning. But at a world level, you must have these two elements. And this corresponds also to what our president said 1 hour ago. That is, we live in a liquid society in which politics has no power. Yes, that's the reason why policy has no power. The power of politics is to levy taxes. And we can't, because in a globalized economy, the economy is globalized and politics is not globalized. And here I wish to remind another great encyclical that is of Pope Benedict XVI. I grow old, I forget names, titles, when he explains that we need a global governance. Without a global governance, politics will never be able to do what you suggest.
Let me say just a few words. First, the United States could easily choose to tax itself more and would do itself and the world a big favor. That's a power choice, not even a public choice, because in public opinion surveys, 70% of Americans repeatedly say that the rich should pay more in taxes. But because that doesn't matter for how our government works, the taxes go down, not up. That's something absolutely within the reach of the United States itself. Second, of course, we need a fiscal agreement on the corruption that was shown in the Panama files. But everybody should understand that this is not the country of Panama somehow defying the international system. This is the country of Panama as a branch office of Washington, New York, and London. Everything is done by London and the US on creating the tax havens. The biggest tax haven in the world is the Caribbean. Trillions of dollars there, all of it US, because much of it is part there, but all of it US driven. You can imagine the implications. Of course, the British invented the tax havens beforehand, the British Virgin Islands that were major tax havens. So this is something completely known to the core power structure of the world economy. It's not a hopeless, we just have to throw up our hands. Companies are embarrassed by it, but the disclosures have to come through WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden and others, because it's hidden, and there's a great complicity of our governments. I know a lot of it because I travel in these circles, so I hear a lot. The games are unimaginable. The cheating is unbelievable. But it's not solving a problem of 193 countries, it's solving a problem of 1 or 2 countries. The United States is at the center of the world financial system. This should be understood structurally. Every transaction goes through the US. The US officials know about all the transactions too. They're all traceable. When they want to pick, they can pick. When they want to let free, they let free. That's why FIFA could be picked up one day, because all the banking transactions go through US banks. So these are choices that we're making, but we're living in a society of impunity right now. We can't throw up our hands and say, that's just the way that it is, because it will do us in. And it's not a matter of the public not wanting this. Most people are not corrupt. They're really, my experience now in 40 years of working in this field is that Lord Acton got it exactly right when he said power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The problems are at the top, and we need to focus attention on power and what it is doing in the world, because that's where the abuses come. And things that I work on, like controlling malaria, these are easy problems. They're technically known, saving mothers, saving children, having safe water, having sanitation. These are not hard problems. Our leaders pretend they're hard problems, or they wring their hands, they say, how tragic, if only we could do something. But I've sat in the White House with dinner with the president, and they don't move. They don't try. And that's why, ultimately, this is very difficult. Ultimately, this requires fundamentally a social conscience and awareness. The most important point is breaking the indifference and helping people to understand and connect the dots. Because then it's not that we're overwhelmed with the complexity. We're just overwhelmed with the impunity. That's the point I'm trying to make. And the public senses it. That's why people are mad everywhere. They sense this is not delivering for us. And so and that's also why 7 billion people are flocking to Pope Francis, because he's saying things that make sense and resonate with people. But we have to translate this into it's not good enough, business as usual. We're told also by the media, because they are big owners and so forth, you can't do better. But it's the same system that is creating that view that this is impossible to stop. So it wouldn't take more than a day at a technical level to say to the Cayman Islands, sorry, but the game's over. We tried, you know. Do you know that this law firm, this Fonseca that had the leaks, their defense was, well, we made 300,000 corporations, and only a few of them are mentioned in these leaks. How could one law firm make 300,000 corporations? Because their job is to disguise identities for secrecy. This is a game. I guarantee you every single financial official in Washington and London knows the game entirely. Every major accounting firm is part of the game, but because it's a game. And when you go to dinner on Wall Street, as I do, and I don't like it, but I go because I'm an anthropologist studying my neighbors, the sense of entitlement is beyond imagining. It's a disease. It really is a disease. They can't even understand. What are people questioning us? What is their problem? So it comes to the mentality. And that's why it fundamentally is not technical issues, it's fundamentally moral issues. The technical problems can be solved.
Let me simply add two very quick point. Now, as I said before, taxation is a necessary but not sufficient condition. But why is not sufficient? Because taxation intervenes post factum, which means intervenes when the income has been produced. Now, in the present days, that is not enough. We need to intervene at the moment when income or riches are produced. That is why taxation remains, but is not the only one instrument to this regard. The second remark is to do with the phenomenon of globalization. As we know, globalization was born out of an action of politicians. That is what we keep on forgetting. It was born in November 1975, when in the castle of Rambouillet, nearby Paris, there was the first G6 summit. G6, and Italy was one of the 6. And in that historic, if we read the minutes of the meeting, was taken the decision to start the globalization. By the way, the word globalization was coined by the American journalist Theodore Levitt in 1981. Before did not exist the word globalization. And since nomina sunt consequentia rerum, it means that there was no substance. Why is that important? Even though some economists, they pretend to say, to convince that globalization is a mere magnification of international economic relations, which is not true, because it's an emergent phenomenon, as sociologists call it, because before, international relations always existed, import-export, but globalization is something new. Why it is important to stress the point? Because if it was a political decision to start globalization, it has to be another political decision to cope with the necessity or the big holes that globalization has created. Now, the difficulty is that our national governments, they are playing what is called a multi-personal prisoner's dilemma game. In a multi-personal prisoner's dilemma game, nobody has the courage or the interest to move the first steps. And since that is replicated by everybody else, nothing. So now, what both theory and experiments show to us is that if you want to cut the vicious circle of the prisoner's dilemma, we need what has been called prophetic minorities. And that is why, in my opinion, the strategic role of organized civil society. We have to introduce into the pictures, because otherwise the prisoner's dilemma cannot be solved. And in this sense, my reading of the present Pope, but Benedict and John Paul II, and even Paul VI goes, or their intervention goes in this direction, to remobilize civil society, as it was the case many centuries ago at the time of humanism and the Renaissance. Humanism and Renaissance were created not by the kings or the dukes of the time, but by civil society. Entrepreneurs and not churches, etc. So we need something, a new strategy these days. On the other hand, if we remain within state and market dichotomous model social orders, I do not perceive any way out of the present situation.
Sorry, Margaret. ¿Te puede, Margaret? Sí, te puede.
Well, actually, Stefano has just said exactly what I was going to say, which is let us not forget the absences in this discussion. We've talked a lot about politics and we've talked a lot about economics, and we've ended up with technical suggestions about solutions and nothing more than that. We have not ended up with transformation of structures. And this is what is absolutely indispensable. And as Stefano has just said, if we just remain with these two players, it's an insoluble situation. It's what Pier Paolo Donati in any number of books has called the lib-lab solution. The liberals reign when they are in power, when the discrepancies in the benefits received by the people become too great, then we have a swap over, an oscillation towards state intervention, increased taxation, etc., and then there becomes an outcry against that, and we get creeping inequality yet again. That's really the crux of the inability to solve the prisoner's dilemma. What we need is to insert the third player, and this is just what Zamani has just said. We need a robust civil society articulating ethical ends for the people and doing something more than that, because that just sounds like a request for yet another old-fashioned social movement. And we know these are very easy to do digitally, but they don't last. The Charlie Hebdo example, millions of people out there in Place de la République, and 2 months later, it had vanished. We need organizations of civil society that put forward alternative, cooperative solutions, not ones that pander to individual greed, not ones that reduce the common good to the per capita benefit per person. That is not what the common good is about. It's not about being better off in cash terms. And it would be nice to have some examples, because they exist, of pro-social banks, pro-social investment schemes, pro-social organizations, food banks, for any number of needed social services that are provided for the people and by the people. And without this third player, I don't see that this deadlock between the state and the market can be unraveled. It will just go on oscillating. Thank you.
I celebrate that we are devoting some time to discussing policies or actions, because normally we spend most of the time to discuss conceptualizations of diagnosis. But even now, I think we are mainly discussing policies suited to developed countries or originated in developed countries and then go into the international level. So I wonder some things about emerging countries, and in particular I have the following point. If you see the economic and social performance of emerging countries in this century, the dispersion is amazing. You have very successful emerging countries and very unsuccessful ones. So, in my perception, one of the keys that explains this dispersion is the fact that macroeconomic policies have been very different between them. In some cases, policies try to maximize today welfare. In other cases, they think more in permanent improvement of welfare. I would like to listen from the speakers some reflections on this very difficult issue, because it's very different even to convey to people that are not economists in general, to politicians, to general people. It's very difficult to explain how there is some sort of equilibrium between the present and the future welfare.
I think from the point of view of the development process, the most important factor indeed is investing, but investing in the right ways, and starting with the human investment, health, and education. And without a basic framework of health and then a strong education process, nothing else in development can work. If one looks at the very rapid development of East Asia, which is certainly the fastest development in the world in the last 2 generations, the rigor and excellence of the education system stands out as a remarkable feature. Indeed, if you look at what are the internationally standardized tests called PISA, the Program on International Scholastic Achievement, that the OECD tests in 70 countries around the world, Korea, China, Japan, Singapore, and Taiwan are at the top of the world's list, and they are the ones that took off. Because economically, what is absolutely true is we live in a technological era, and to be able to attract investment and prosperity requires the ability to manage sophisticated processes. So numeracy, scientific knowledge, technical knowledge is absolutely essential from an economic point of view. I would then add, from a government's point of view, investing in infrastructure, electrification, roads, water, sanitation are fundamental as well. So the real success stories are, for whatever reasons, countries that have chosen a path of honest, decent, broad-based investment that have the basic philosophy that all children should be able to reach potential. And that's not a bad moral as well as a practical starting point from a development agenda. And one should add that for middle-income countries, this is broadly within reach of the budgets of middle-income countries to be able to implement a decent, reasonable program of education, health, and basic infrastructure. For very poor countries, it's not within their own financial reach, and that's where international cooperation in principle is supposed to occur. And when it does occur, it makes a difference, and when it doesn't occur, you find countries trapped in poverty. And so that's a very practical consideration. So I just would emphasize the investment dimension. That means looking to the future. It means taking the time to build the serious base of human knowledge, skills, health, and physical infrastructure on which a market economy, a private sector economy can operate. I did want to also say one word, Margaret, following up on your point. I would distinguish myself two different ways that civil society can play a pivotal role. One that you mentioned is direct provision, benefit companies, and so forth. I believe that plays some role, but I don't think it's a decisive role, because the decisive structures of the world economy are really big structures, and they're very powerful, and they are deeply embedded systems. The other place where civil society plays a role is the church's role, which is to inform, educate, spur, open minds, and say what is wrong. And I do believe social movements have been the most powerful movements of modern history, starting with the movement to end slavery and many, many social movements. And this church is leading a social movement on the social teachings. And I think that that role is indispensable right now.
Presidente. Monseñor, más que una pregunta, es una reflexión, damos el punto de discusión. Yo soy aquí de los pocos hombres políticos, presidente de un país, pero también tengo la experiencia de la academia y soy economista, a pesar de eso soy una buena persona. Entonces, sí veo esa un poco la mentalidad, ¿no? De que, por definición, pues los hombres políticos, no sé, por qué arte de magia uno puede ser buena persona en la parte privada, tiene la mala suerte de ganar una elección y se vuelve malvado, o sospechoso al menos. Entonces, yo creo que eso hace mucho daño, de eso voy a hablar un poquito hoy de tarde, y lo que se busca es legitimar el poder político y cómo se cambian estructuras tan injustas como la América Latina sin ese poder político. Aquí se ha dicho que la sociedad civil tiene una importante participación. Yo les digo que hay que tener mucho cuidado con aquello. Depende cómo se define el Estado. O sea, algunas veces cuando me hablan ciertos opositores de que nosotros somos representantes de la sociedad civil, yo me pregunto, ¿representante quién soy? De los marcianos entonces, por haber ganado una elección. Depende cómo definamos el Estado. El Estado se puede definir como la representación institucionalizada de la sociedad, por medio del cual esa sociedad realiza su acción colectiva. ¿Y cómo se decide esa acción colectiva? Por medio de procesos políticos, por eso lo importante de la política. Que puede haber exageraciones del Estado, como la enunció Juan Pablo II en su encíclica Centesimus, por supuesto, pero la solución no necesariamente es menos Estado, sino más democracia, más control democrático. Esa es otra cosa, porque a mí sí me preocupa cuando se quiere reemplazar al Estado y a la política con una definición ambigua de sociedad civil. Es en este mundo que vivimos hay cerveza sin alcohol, tabaco sin nicotina, café sin cafeína y quieren tener política sin políticos, ¿no? Entonces, sí me preocupa un poquito eso, porque para mí no hay nada más peligroso para la democracia que actores políticos sin responsabilidad política. Y es una cosa que está sufriendo América Latina. Por ejemplo, una invasión de ONGs, muchas de ellas no espontáneas, que no son organizaciones no gubernamentales, sino organizaciones de otros gobiernos, además de poderes fácticos que quieren poner la agenda política sin responsabilidad política, sin legitimidad democrática, y eso es muy grave para la democracia. Así que hemos tenido mucho cuidado con lo que definamos como sociedad civil. Por supuesto, la sociedad civil enriquece la discusión, enriquece la toma de decisiones, etc. Pero las decisiones las deben tomar hombres políticos con legitimidad democrática y con responsabilidad política. ¿Okay?
Gracias, presidente. En los estatutos, el primer estatuto de la Academia de Ciencias Sociales dice que tenemos que profundizar en los temas sociales y políticos. Por eso lo hemos invitado a usted, presidente, porque tiene experiencia en política y no hace solo filosofía de la política. Y es un honor enorme que usted haya aceptado venir para poder profundizar en estos temas. El tema que usted propone es muy importante. Gracias, presidente. Ahora le doy la palabra a Zach.
I think it is a very brilliant statement, and the statement is not less government but more democracy. And I think it's a really important point. Many of the systems changes we need require the systems of collective action. In fact, most of the systems we need, whether it's energy systems, health systems, education systems, and so on. It was once the philosophical view, and certainly it was Aristotle's view, and it's the church's view, that government is the expression of that common interest for these systems. And that is right if the institutions of government connect to the well-being of the people. And therefore, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, which is we will not solve these problems without government. But my government and many other governments are unresponsive to the public will now in an absolutely direct way, even though the formal structures of democracy are there. We can actually quantitatively show the disconnection between the public will and the political process. So that is what needs to be reconnected. And where civil society comes in fundamentally, in my view, is to animate the public spirit and to animate the sense of the common good. Without that, also, we're all lost. Without the knowledge, the wisdom, if I didn't have the benefit of reading these magnificent documents, listening to magnificent people here, I wouldn't know. So we need that constant education, discernment. We need to read Aristotle. We need to read Thomas Aquinas. We need to read the encyclicals because we won't know otherwise. And if we can use that for our common good and then use that to press on our institutions so that they are institutions of the common good, like you said, Mr. President, I think that really gives the answer. We can't do without government because we need collective action for the common good. The decentralized approach won't work for absolutely understandable reasons. The systems of our lives require common action. And yet, when the systems become responsive only to small minorities at the top, then we face the crisis we face.
Yeah. Okay.
enormous amount from both our professors. They both point to systemic problems, global systemic problems, not only in economics, but also in politics. The problem with finding remedies for global systemic problems is you have to find collective agents who can remedy those. And we've heard the possibility suggested of civil society, and that hasn't attracted so much support, I think. The problem with civil society is, of course, time and again, it is motivated by very well-meaning people who nonetheless are carried away by their own charismatic impact. So it becomes the cult of personality in civil society. But nonetheless, we are then dealing with people who feel themselves responsible agents. And what we have to do is to locate the responsible agents in global society. I just want to raise one unpopular possibility. I suggest it is unpopular because nobody's had a good word to say for rich people so far. Nobody's had anything to say for the elites. And I know it's very difficult for rich people to pass through the eye of a needle. Nonetheless, there are prime examples out there. I mean, Bill Gates is only the most obvious, of people motivated and active in promoting effective action in the world. Now, I believe Gates is now associated with, 30 or 40 billionaires who are all saying, look, we should pay taxes. Now, it does seem to me that we ought to embrace rich people as well as poor people. Rich people are themselves conflicted. They understand the global system, which is why they can benefit from it, but they also understand, as it were, in their consciences, that this is not just. So I do think it's important for moral agencies like the Catholic Church to address the problem of enlisting the wealthy in the world to support the cause of the common good. It hasn't been said so far, but this is my suggestion at any rate.
Can I say?
Is your discussion.
I'll give you some numbers for your case. There are 1,826 billionaires registered on the Forbes billionaire list. Their combined net worth is $7.1 trillion. So if, I've often suggested, if the billionaires would pool their resources, just 1,800, into a common fund and treat it like a university endowment, perhaps managed by the Pontifical Academy, the flow of funds at a normal 5% payout would be $350 billion a year. That's 1,826 individuals. 350 billion, that's the income flow that is the normal 5% payout from their resources. I can tell you as an economist that 350 billion flow a year would end all poverty, would save 6 million children from dying every year, would end all controllable, preventable disease, would ensure universal education of all children, at least through secondary and vocational education in the whole world, and do a lot of other interesting things too. So from a quantified point of view, you're absolutely correct. And I can tell you, because Bill Gates has funded a lot of the public health initiatives, one person made an absolutely consequential difference, he and his wife, because they've spent $3 or $4 billion a year on health, and they started together with President Bush and others, the Global Fund that I mentioned earlier. So this is no doubt part of an answer. It can't come with impunity, with the get out of jail free pass, with the right to keep your taxes at zero, and with other benefits that some of these individuals seem to demand in their other mode. But with a hard-headed view, it goes back in our country, in the United States, to Andrew Carnegie, who wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth in the 1880s. And he said in The Gospel of Wealth, interestingly, because it's in line with the universal destination of goods, he said, I happen to be very good at making money, but it's not my money. It belongs to the whole community. And therefore, it would be a disgrace for me to die with my wealth, so I will give it all away in my lifetime. He then also went on to say, I'm also good with managing money, so I will manage the giveaway in the Carnegie Endowment, in Carnegie Libraries, in Carnegie Hall, in many other initiatives. But I think that this is absolutely another piece of the puzzle that we should not neglect. It's a lot of money. I've been trying to find the Bill Gates for education, because Bill Gates for health has made a difference, but we don't have an education, for example, a philanthropy at that scale that could help to address the needs of 100 million kids who are not literate and not numerate and who have no prospect in this century unless that problem is solved. So I would suggest any billionaires you know, have them write to the Pontifical Academy, and we will help them to solve their problems in a very practical way.
Thank you so much for that. Just a poignant footnote to what you've just said, which is 4 or 5 miles from where I live, there is a Carnegie Library. Carnegie Library, which still exists, funded from that original fund.
That's it.
But even more telling is at the moment it is occupied by parents and children because they are trying to stop its closure by the local authority. I really think we should probably cite you as the support for their cause, because they haven't got much support from anywhere else.
Just a remark to what President Correa said before. Yes, you refer to the NGO, but perhaps that is not the best case to represent the totality of civil society organization. They are one element, but there are many other expressions. For instance, IGO. IGO are international government organizations, and they are started. I would favor, if I were, let's say, a politician in government, to do that. For instance, that is, by the way, the idea which is expressed in the last part of Caritas in Veritate by Benedict XVI, when he talks about polyarchy. Pope Benedict never mentioned the global government, which would be, in my opinion, a disaster. But he was talking about global governance, And global governance is enacted via polyarchy, which means plurality of the central power. And the IGOs today are an important instrument, even from a legal point of view, though the experts in international law have produced important results in that direction. So far, we have only the IGO concerning the banking system, the Basel Agreement, or even the WTA, but something similar can be done concerning the creation of a world environmental organization. Why not? That is the proposal emerging from the last encyclical, etc. So, second remark is that, as was said by Jeffrey, public, in my opinion, should not be identified only with the government or with the state. The state is an important part of the public, in the public ethos. But public is everything which is not only reserved to individuals. In this sense, we need to strengthen the networking of civil society organizations. Finally, you are right on the point of democracy. But as we know, there are many different models of democracy. The one which is in our countries more or less dominant is the elitistic competitive model of democracy, which was invented by Max Weber and Schumpeter later. But today we talk about deliberative democracy, for instance, as an alternative. Because it is obvious that if we reduce democracy only to what has been called electoral democracy, that is too little. Democracy cannot be reduced only to the moment when people go to vote. You need also to strengthen the links among people living in a certain polity in order to apply the rule of law instead of the rule by law. So even in this sense, we need to strengthen, give voice to different aspects. And in this regard, the concept of biodiversity applies perfectly well to our world. So far, we have applied biodiversity only to the natural world, which is okay. But biodiversity applies also to the economic and the political dimension of civil.
Yo me refería sobre todo a las organizaciones ONG acting inside a country, dentro de un país, que es un problema porque muchas de esas organizaciones no son organizaciones sin fines no gubernamentales, sino de otros gobiernos. Y muchas no son organizaciones sin fines de lucro, sino de lucro sin fin, o sin fines confesables. Por ejemplo, ¿no? Lo que no logran en sus países tratan de imponernos en los nuestros. Para aprovechar nuestros recursos naturales tenemos que enfrentar grandes problemas de ciertas dirigencias indígenas, etcétera, que son pagadas, mantenidas por estas organizaciones y hacen mucho daño al avance de nuestros países, a la correcta toma de decisiones, etcétera. Usted ha hablado de las organizaciones internacionales. Al igual que las ONGs, hay buenas y hay malas, ¿no? Yo creo, y eso lo voy a hablar hoy de tarde, que uno de los graves problemas de la globalización neoliberal es la falta de gobernanza a nivel mundial, instituciones que controlen esa globalización. Pero hay algunas instituciones, sí le puedo decir que la mayoría están tomadas por los intereses de los países hegemónicos y por el gran capital. Incluso hay algunas que no tienen ninguna legitimidad, como el GAFI, Grupo de Acción Financiera. Este es un grupo que formó Estados Unidos con las 7 economías más fuertes del mundo después de los ataques del septiembre 11 del 2001. No depende de las Naciones Unidas, no es acuerdo internacional, es un grupo de facto. Pero país que no cumple con sus requerimientos, lo ponen en listas negras, listas grises para impedirle el financiamiento. Pero lo más triste es que lo que exigen a los otros no se exige a ellos mismos. Por ejemplo, la mayor parte de paraísos fiscales está dentro de esas 7 economías más poderosas. La mayor parte, con todo respeto, de paraísos fiscales está en el propio Estados Unidos y en países pertenecientes al Commonwealth. Panamá creo que está en el 7º lugar a nivel mundial en paraísos fiscales. Y ya que tocamos de nuevo Panama Papers para que vean los sesgos, esa información la tienen casi un año, más de 10 millones de récords. En el caso ecuatoriano, trataron de buscar solo los nombres que perjudicaran al gobierno, bajo la premisa de que solo los políticos somos corruptos. No encontraron nada, para mucho orgullo nuestro, porque somos un gobierno honesto, pero no quieren soltar el resto de información, diciendo que el resto es decisión libre de empresarios privados. Bueno, si no hay nada de malo, ¿por qué no conocer esa información? Entonces estamos en toda una campaña internacional, ojalá nos pueda ayudar la Academia de Ciencias, el Vaticano, para que liberen toda la información y saber quién es quién. ¿Okay?
Gracias, presidente.
Yo quiero dar seguimiento a lo que ha dicho el señor presidente, porque en el CELAM, más o menos hace 26, 27 años, fue cuando empezamos a hacer la primera reflexión sobre sociedad civil. Al principio teníamos hasta oposición, no se quería hablar de sociedad civil, pero posteriormente yo he visto lo que dice el señor presidente. Muchas veces la sociedad civil se ha reducido a organizaciones no gubernamentales que se constituyen en como una alternativa para el gobierno, y no es ese su papel. Nosotros desde el principio dijimos sociedad civil, ¿qué es? Es la sociedad organizada para buscar el bien común, pero también lo que ha dicho el señor presidente, para muchos, yo tengo experiencia bastante en América Central, organizar una NGO es vencer el desempleo, porque ellos mismos se emplean ahí y buscan financiamiento de otros organismos internacionales que están muy interesados en ejercer el poder para sus propios fines. Yo creo que este debe ser motivo de una profunda reflexión. ¿Quiénes son verdaderamente organizaciones de sociedad civil y quiénes son simplemente grupos de poder para buscar ventajas económicas y con fines de lucro, no sin fines de lucro? Segunda cosa que me recuerdo cuando los del Banco Mundial y del Fondo Monetario Internacional ofrecían mucho dinero para programas que decían era hacer más pequeño el gobierno. Es cierto, hubo una tendencia en muchos países a aumentar la burocracia para crear empleos a sus seguidores en los partidos políticos. Esto ha sido verdaderamente negativo. Pero lo que yo veía dentro era otra ideología, y era precisamente hacer lo más pequeño posible el gobierno para que fuera simplemente protector del capital, pero no su servicio al bien común. Y este es otro de los problemas que yo creo vale la pena enfrentar. En tercer lugar, ya existe esa academia de los países ricos. Davos, por ejemplo. ¿En qué consiste? Yo fui una vez invitado a Davos y creo que no me volverán a invitar nunca más, porque yo hablé muy claramente diciéndoles, ¿qué son ustedes para el bien común del mundo? Simplemente una asociación que busca bien reunirse y todo para protegerse, pero no para proyectarse en el bien común del mundo. Lo que decía Jeffrey es verdaderamente emocionante si lográsemos que ese capital, en lugar de estar durmiendo o estar ahí haciendo lo que les da la gana. Me planteo, por ejemplo, lo que él nos dijo sobre las medicinas, que es un escándalo mundial, un escándalo mundial. Los más pobres tienen que pagar precios enormes por las medicinas y las casas farmacéuticas hacen ganancias enormes para que mueran, ¿quiénes? Los pobres que no pueden comprar medicina. Este es otro punto. ¿Cómo hacer para llegar a ellos? ¿Cómo hacer que Forbes, en lugar de publicar solamente una lista de los más ricos, dijese, pongamos una lista de los más preocupados por el bien común y de los más solidarios entre ellos? Yo creo que valdría la pena.
Anche io voglio fare una... però prego.
Well, since Mr. Albro has broken a taboo and has spoken of the possibility that the rich might be good, I shall try to break another one. You are looking for the subject of social change. Well, in the history of the European countries, the Nordic countries included, these agents were political parties, popular political parties who succeeded in gathering popular support for strong reforms in the service of the common good. Do you think that perhaps there is some connection between the general crisis of political parties in the era of de-ideologization and the fact that politics becomes more and more subservient to the economic power?
I think it is a good question of where the impulse for major social change has come. Sometimes it has been political parties, but I don't think that's been the predominant source. I would say in Scandinavia, the Social Democratic Party played a historic role, but I would point to at least two other major groups. One is the trade unions, which were of fundamental significance. Pardon me? In the Yeah. No, but I'm saying in the United States, for example.
It is the same in the Scandinavian countries.
But what I'm saying is that in the Solidarity movement in Poland or in the United States and so forth, these were voluntary associations, not political parties. Political parties eventually came because politicians often follow social calls that they see votes or some avenue to power there, or an accident happens and a politician with a vision takes up the cause. But I would say that that's one area. And then true civil society leadership in what was I think the first of the great modern social movements was ending slavery. And that was a cause in the UK for 50 years, from the 1770s through the 1820s, starting with Wilberforce and others. And that was not a political party at the beginning. That was the Methodists and many religious groups that did that. In the United States, our greatest social movements in the last 50 years were definitely not the political parties, but for example, the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a movement of tremendously brave African-American leaders and religious figures who sided with them. And the parties were terrified, both of them. How do we get involved? What do we do? And that was really the prophetic minority in the most difficult sense, because dogs and water hoses and so on and beatings and lynchings were the response for quite a long time. So it's a very good question. These changes come from many different directions. They don't come from one. To my mind, that signals something important, which is that the ideas really matter. And the ideas of what is the common good, what are our stakes, what is important, is essential, because that common frame then motivates different sectors, parties, leaders, individuals to do different things. We don't have a single coordinated way or solution. That's personally why I like these UN goals. Even though I have no illusions about the translation of these UN goals directly into action, I work at the UN. How could I have any illusions about that? But on the other hand, they are global. They are goals. They command attention. And I think attention is critical here. And I would make one other analogy, if I might, a loose one, to neuroscience. the neuroscientists who study consciousness know that rational decision-making requires consciousness. And when they ask in the brain state, what is consciousness, they've come to the view that consciousness is that the brain is at the attention of a particular issue. It sounds strange, but all the systems of the brain are energized on a particular focus. And it's that attention in the brain that then allows the so-called executive function in the prefrontal cortex to say, do something deliberate, not as a reflex, but deliberate, volitional. So I think this concept of attention is crucial, because without the world's attention, we can't make the changes. Now, the competition for attention is phenomenal, because we have more terabytes of incidental sensory stimuli coming our way that are manufactured to try to grab our attention. As you walk through an airport or walk through the town, the billboards become more and more dramatic, vulgar, anything to get your fleeting attention. So the competition for attention is very, very difficult. I think it is objectively the case that, I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to impose anything more, but Pope Francis has the world's attention more than any other single person in the whole world, because what he's saying is resonating. So attention is vital to this story. I don't think we can expect a single key, whether it's a president like President Correa who can make a very brave action, or whether it's trade unions who jump over the wall of the Gdansk shipyard, or whether it's a woman who sits in the front seat of the bus. We don't know where this is going to come from, but the attention to follow it, to my mind, is the most important thing we can muster. Because if we have that, most people are decent and most people can be touched in the way to say that's the right thing to do. That's the definition of the common good. It can be recognized, but we need the attention, I think, to have that.
I want to ask something, Jeffrey. As you know, when Aristotle established the different form of government, he said that the corruption of the democracy is the plutocracy. And this, he said, this can go against the democracy. And I ask to you, if this corruption that you say, that is very clear today, of many countries that in his constitution are very democratic, could be also a corruption, plutocratic, that can also destroy the democracy? Because this is really a great problem.
If you ask Americans these days, is the country in the right direction? The no dominates the yes by about 40 percentage points. It's astounding. The mood is very sour. If you ask the approval rating of the US Congress, it's 12%. In other words, the institutions are not working with the legitimacy. And the overwhelming sense of Americans is that our politicians are bought. This is the overwhelming sense in our politics right now. And the truth is, we can track much of the money flows, which have reached, as I said, in the last election cycle, $7.5 billion, and this election cycle, maybe $10 billion. Because of the Supreme Court rulings, we can't track all the money anymore. They can be totally anonymous and still be given. This is a drama, and it shows up in this disconnection of political outcomes and public opinion, which can be documented rigorously. We go to wars that the public doesn't want. We don't regulate when the public wants it. We don't fight climate change when the public wants it. And so all of this now can be documented very systematically. In the old theory of democracy, the so-called median voter, the one in the middle, would be the commanding vote, because that's where you would get the 50%. But we now know in the US, objectively, mathematically, it's the voter at the top of the income distribution that's the determining vote. American society is quite open. I believe this will change because we still have a very open system, a lot of freedom to discuss. I can say these things every day and not be fearful of my life or anything else, and that's a privilege that is very rare in this world. And the public agrees that it's bad, but changing deeply entrenched processes are extremely difficult, and they require a tremendous, consistent, ongoing effort. And in the United States history, we had 3 big waves of reform against plutocracy. One was in the progressive era in the first decade of the 20th century. The second was the New Deal, and the third was the 1960s, Kennedy and Johnson. Since then, we have been basically in a tax-cutting, government-cutting mode consistently for 40 years. And this is where we stand right now in our country.
There are more questions? We have some more minutes. Oh, sorry, please.
Our attention's been drawn to two things I can see. One is this sort of unfettered power in developed nations, very movingly and convincingly. And then the existence of these sort of public problems requiring public action, right? Like, and from the developed world to the developing world. The one problem that I haven't heard mentioned is an important public good in the developing world is the rule of law, and access to that, particularly among the poor, is a big problem, which would help to democratize capital. If were able to get title to their properties, to register businesses, things like that. Have we not talked about corruption at that level because it's a more difficult problem to actually grapple with, or is because it doesn't seem as important as these other ones, or it pales in some sense?
I'll give you my own interpretation of a very complicated question. First, there are states that are so corrupt and in the hands of individuals that they basically are unmanageable. And we see some of that impunity today, even in some of the names from the Panama files. I deal with some of those governments, and it's clear how much robbery is underway. And in those states, there's almost nothing that can be done until there's some rectification of that process. It's very serious. There's another tragic side to this as well, which we shouldn't lose, because I believe that the powerful bear heavy responsibilities that are often not recognized. So many of the worst governments in the world today were installed by the United States. And many of the best governments in the world were overthrown by the United States. So Arbenz in Guatemala, for example, was overthrown in 1954 because he wanted agrarian reform. Mossadegh in Iran was overthrown as a democratic government because he said that oil belongs to us, not to Britain. That was quite alarming to the CIA and the MI6. Lumumba was overthrown in Congo in 1960 by the CIA and the Belgians because he was a legitimate, popular ruler, and we put in Mobutu Sese Seko instead because he was our agent. This is a story all over the world. And it's not surprising when one starts to think about it how power has a disproportionate role. And especially in the last century, the UK and the US played the dominant role in much of the world in which governments were in power, especially outside of the Soviet bloc, as one would call it. The more I've worked in these countries, the more I see the legacy of these interventions. They're very long, they're very deep, they're very tragic. And this is a big problem of the power, the impunity. We don't even know in our own American history. We don't learn about these things. In fact, there was an article about the Mossadegh overthrow in Foreign Affairs magazine last year. It was a disgraceful article because it said what a terrible man he was. He just couldn't reason with the US and the UK. So he had to be dismissed because he was unreasonable. This was written by the leading foreign policy journal of the leading foreign policy association. But of course, the core establishment of the US, I live a few blocks away, and I'm a member of it, by the way. But the mindset is so powerful that we don't see what we've done. The CIA overthrew the first Democrat, one after another. Just after the CIA was formed, it started overthrowing governments in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran. And then we look back and say, why can't they govern themselves? Because we never let them govern themselves. It was the design of the system. So I do think that this question is a very serious one, and it requires a historical analysis. And I don't want to say it's all the US and UK, but those were the two most powerful countries of the last century. And they played a direct role in the colonial era and now in the military bases era of who actually governs. And one of the things President Correa referred to, I know it firsthand. What are called NGOs often are actually paid for the US government, the National Democratic Institute and the National Republican Institute, to foment unrest that turns into actual coups. And it's not a figment of my imagination. I work in these countries on the ground. And it's incredible. It's a machinery. It's not a good machinery, because nothing good can come from the replacement of a government by another government, by covert operations. It's impossible. You cannot run another country from the outside. And this is a common procedure, actually. So I think if we championed good governance and made the norms, but told the powerful countries, back off. And my specific proposal, I don't mean to be more melodramatic, but I just want to make a very specific policy proposal, which I make in the US. It's not for the Pontifical Academy. But in 1947, when the CIA was established, it was given two roles. One was intelligence, and the other was a covert army for the President of the United States. Truman was very worried about that second role. Many people, George Marshall said, why are we combining these two? It will be a disaster. We've now had 60 years. We've overthrown dozens of governments through covert operations. Every time it's a disaster. And so I strongly am urging a reform of the National Security Act of 1947 so that we end a covert army in the United States, because then we can allow democracy to take shape on the ground from domestic forces.
We have time for one more question. Oh, we can finish. Sorry. We finish with this question, sorry.
Ya. Voy a hablar español porque creo que es una de las lenguas más habladas en esta aula. Yo quería, en base a lo que hemos escuchado, yo creo que podemos decir que este sistema en el cual estamos viviendo, ese sistema que ha globalizado toda la Tierra, es básicamente fundado en la desigualdad. Desigualdad entre la gente y desigualdad entre países. Y eso me refiero a lo que decía el profesor Sachs cuando hablaba de Polonia. Yo me acuerdo cuando los sindicatos italianos de Fiat decían y suplicaban a los sindicatos polacos de Fiat de que se rehusaran a trabajar por un sueldo mucho mejor, mucho más bajo que lo que ellos percibían en Italia, porque eso los obligaba a bajar su sueldo. Entonces, eso es, yo digo que el ejemplo en la historia, yo creo que antes se empezó en Brasil, donde el 20% de la población era el mercado suficiente y el 80% de la población era el mercado de sobra. Entonces, yo digo que la economía debería ser simplemente la manera de utilizar mejor los medios que disponemos, no los medios que creemos disponer. Entonces, si esta es la economía, sí, termino inmediatamente. Si esta es la base de la economía, entonces cuestiones de morales, cuestiones de ética, etcétera, debería ser automáticamente evitada. No hay más medios de lo que existen. Y en fin, el último concepto que me parece importante, y yo solo voy a hablarlo, es el concepto de la apropiación. Es decir, hasta dónde es permitido apropiarse y de qué podemos apropiarse. Muchas gracias.
Again, a very complicated question, but I'll just make one remark. Pope Francis says in Laudato Si that private property rights are not inviolable. And the doctrine, which I think is a compelling doctrine, is the universal destination of goods, meaning that while private property and markets can be useful for how society uses its resources, they are not the controlling moral framework. The moral framework is the common good. And that is because ultimately property rights have to respond to the common good. And if property rights lead to a perversion, and there are many examples, then they have to be overridden in the name of the common good. And I'll give an example of this, which was very pertinent for us. The United States has never signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. The reason is that Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives in the US in 1994, said that it is not right to make private property owners have to defend biodiversity. It's a violation of private property rights. And the large landowners in the United States got their representatives, especially from the US western states, to vote down the ratification of the Convention on Biological Diversity because they said, we have this is our land. We can destroy biodiversity on our land if we want. So this is exactly a vivid question of where are the property rights? For the church, the property rights are for the common good, so it's unquestionable that an individual does not have the right to destroy biodiversity. Maybe they have a deed to land, but that is not an inviolable deed that allows for the destruction of the creation. And but our thinking in the US was so unclear that this was never ratified. And now we face one of the great extinction waves of biodiversity on the whole planet because we couldn't even understand that private property had to be overridden to protect biodiversity. So this is an issue that's faced every day, and I think the church has it exactly right. Yes, private property, but no to inviolable private property. Yes to the common good.